Have you ever had one of those days where your girlfriend suddenly grows a giant metal phallus and tries to kill you? If you have, then this clip from the 1989 film Tetsuo the Iron Man probably rings true. But if you haven't, welcome to a new world. Tetsuo is one of a handful of Japanese films released between the late 70s and the mid 90s that juxtapose life in one of the world's fastest growing economies with insane science fiction elements. Some critics have described these films as surreal horror.
C'est trop chelou.
Others call them Japanese cyberpunk. But I think there's a better term to describe them. Yojohan Sci-Fi. In this beginner's guide, I'm going to unpack that term and take a look at the history of the subgenre. But before we get into it, I want to issue a warning. I am definitely going to mangle all the Japanese words in this video. So if you're offended by that, can I just offer a sincere faku-ofu in advance? The term Yojohan Sci-Fi was invented by the director Shinya Tsukamoto, who described his own films as science fiction in an everyday environment. He chose the word Yojohan because it describes a room with 4.5 tatami mats, a standard living room configuration in a Japanese home. Tsukamoto's Tetsuo the Iron Man is the most well-known Yojohan film, but other directors also mixed the everyday with science fiction. Sogo Ishii, Shigeru Izumiya, and Shozin Fukui shared influences with Tsukamoto and even collaborated with each other. Collaboration mattered because for various reasons the Yojohan directors preferred to work outside the mainstream Japanese film industry. This meant they had to economise, using small unpaid crews and cheap special effects that were nonetheless highly ingenious. There are differences, but the one thing that connects all the Yojohan directors is that their films use science fiction tropes in a recognisable urban setting. So that's pretty clear, aye? How come then they're also referred to as Japanese cyberpunk? I think by now, after what seems like 1,000 YouTube videos on the subject, we're all pretty familiar with what cyberpunk is. But to give it a brief introduction, cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction that emerged in the late 70s, early 80s, most famously with Ridley Scott's film Blade Runner. Tsukamoto and his peers are often lumped into this subgenre. Many critics have identified Blade Runner as an influence on the industrial look and lethal technologies of the Yojohan films. But despite similarities, there's also a big difference. Although cyberpunk is science fiction, the emphasis on world building in the subgenre means that it often approaches a kind of realism. Yojohan, on the other hand, disrupts all sense of realism, with its editing, cinematography, and soundtracks, all of which broke the rules. It's punk filmmaking, more so than actual cyberpunk. Now, it's no coincidence that both cyberpunk and Yojohan emerge at roughly the same historical moment, the late 70s, when neoliberalism is in the ascendant and globalisation is really starting to change the world economy. But Japan's experiences of these processes was different to America's. And as we'll see, it's the history of the Japanese nation that is really the dominant influence on Yojohan. Japanese-US relations are complex. After America defeated Japan in World War II, they invested heavily in the country to rebuild it. But they also had an ulterior motive. By 1959, US army bases dotted the Japanese islands, making it a new front in the Cold War. Many Japanese were angry about this. In 1960, 300,000 protested the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation, which was intended to safeguard those bases. In the end, the treaty was signed, but the protesters forced the resignation of the Prime Minister. These were radical times. Government efforts to curb this radicalism eventually focused on cinema. In 1972, police charged the Nikatsu company with obscenity for their Roman porno films. As the name suggests, these films had a pornographic element, but many also had a political edge. As one executive said, "To show sex is anti-establishment. This is why we do it." The Tokyo High Court recognised that serious intent, and in 1980 acquitted Nikatsu. But the trial came at a difficult time for the studio. Facing bankruptcy, they needed a saviour. In 1978, it looked like they'd found one in an unexpected place. In 1978, Nikatsu, with its 66-year history, broke with tradition and hired a 21-year-old film student, Sogo Ishii, to direct their first non-Roman porno film since 1971. Panic High School was a remake of one of Ishii's short films, and on the face of it, a huge risk for the studio. There was, however, a calculation behind Nikatsu's surprise move. For all his inexperience, Ishii represented the generation that had come after World War II. He liked punk music, he bunked off his classes, and he felt ambivalent about the state and its American sponsors. The studio hoped this would give them purchase with a demographic that had long shunned cinema: teenagers. But Nikatsu weren't going to let him have it all his own way. Years later, Ishii recalled his anger that the studio forced a more experienced co-director on him. Although Panic High School was well received, it made Ishii wary of the studios. It took a lot of money before he agreed to direct Burst City for Toei. Burst City was key in the development of Yojohan Sci-Fi. Ishii saw it as a vehicle for his favourite Tokyo punk bands, like the Stalin and the Roosters. Since the punks were banned from venues outside Tokyo, the film would be a chance for many young Japanese to see their heroes, almost live. Ishii cast them as rebels in a future ruled by big business and patrolled by laser-toting police. But the most important aspect of Burst City turned out to be its depiction of the future. Ishii quickly realised that the budget wasn't that big, so he had to economise, and in doing so, paved the way for Yojohan. Ishii and his art director, Shigeru Izumiya, couldn't afford to build expensive sets, so they used real-life locations, like empty warehouses and abandoned industrial spaces. The punks are living in the ruins of Japan's economic miracle, forced to make do with whatever they can scavenge, which results in some memorable imagery. As we can see in this opening scene, an everyday situation takes a turn for the weird, with the introduction of a visually incongruous element. It's not a rifle or even a laser gun that this motorcycle warrior wields, but an axe. Money worries, more than anything else, forced Ishii to innovate, but with punk bravado, he made it work. The result was hugely influential. Although Toei's failure to release Burst City properly further embittered Ishii, the film lit the touch paper for an explosion of new talent in Japanese cinema. His collaborator, Shigeru Izumiya, was up first. Most Yojohan films were poorly distributed, but Death Powder, released in 1986, is the most obscure of all. The best print of Shigeru Izumiya's film, now available, is a VHS rip you can find on a certain website. This obscurity adds to the film's uncanny quality. The plot is confusing, starting as a Terminator-style thriller about two mercenaries hunting a cyborg, before taking a metaphysical turn when they discover that the cyborg has capacity for emotions. But the plot is less important than the aesthetic. Izumiya was art director on Burst City, and he stuck with that film's industrial look. But he was also older than Sogo Ishii, and involved in the radical art of the 60s. Death Powder is therefore more daring than Burst City, and pushes the Yojohan aspect much further. Where Ishii juxtaposed clashing ideas of modernity, Izumiya introduced surreal horror, as in this scene involving some hapless workies. Alas, Death Powder didn't find an audience in 1986, lost among hundreds of other titles to appear on the popular new VHS tapes. Some of Izumiya's ideas came up again a few years later, however, in the iconic work of Yojohan Sci-Fi, Shinya Tsukamoto's Tetsuo. Released in 1989, Tetsuo the Iron Man is the closest thing to a Yojohan sci-fi blockbuster. Initially ignored by Japanese audiences, it found an international following after screening at the Fanta Festival of Genre Cinema in Italy. The film is about a salaryman, Tetsuo, whose everyday life takes a terrifying turn when he's infected by a metal virus. It's archetypal Yojohan, inspired by Ishii's work on Burst City, but Tsukamoto outdid him. Here's why. 1. Tsukamoto was a better director. He'd been making films since he was 14. Ishii, by contrast, started as a musician, and you can see the difference that makes. Burst City is a bit of a mess, but Tetsuo is totally focused. Cinematography, editing, soundtrack, they're all extensions of the Yojohan theme. There's absolutely no slack. Tsukamoto pins you to a wall for the entire 70 minutes. The second reason Tetsuo was a smash was that Tsukamoto is good at recycling, not just scrap metal, but also pop culture. He referenced the kaiju films he loved as a child, as well as Ultra Q, a TV show that inspired his whole idea of Yojohan Sci-Fi. And of course, his anti-hero shares a name with the villain of Akira. Critics picked up on those references, giving them a context for discussing the film. And that matters. We're more likely to watch something if it's like another thing that we've enjoyed. Indeed, Tetsuo was marketed on its similarities to other cult films. The third reason for its success was the support Tsukamoto received to make it. And crucially, I don't mean studio support. Tsukamoto is a fiercely independent filmmaker. Not a rich one, however, so when he needed yen, he went to PIA, an international film festival held in Tokyo that provided funding for independent filmmakers. His contacts at PIA were plugged into the International Festival Network, and that matters because at the time, mainstream Japanese cinema wasn't on the radar for film programmers. If Tsukamoto had gone to the studios, not only would they have been unable to realise Tetsuo's extreme content, it's also unlikely it would have been sold overseas. Working outside the system had advantages. So those are the reasons why Tetsuo was a sleeper hit. It didn't come out of nowhere. Tsukamoto had many inspirations, but what it did better than anything before it. It's the iconic Yojohan film. Tetsuo's success led to a sequel and several other Yojohan adjacent films. The most notable director in this period was Shozin Fukui. Fukui was an assistant director for Tsukamoto and Ishii before his first feature film, 964 Pinocchio, in 1991. Critics compared it to Tetsuo, but while Tsukamoto focused on physical trauma, Fukui was interested in the moment when the mind overwhelms the body. He took that theme to its end point in his next film, Rubber's Lover. Rubber's Lover follows a team of scientists researching psychic phenomena. These characters have internalised the split between reality and the uncanny. Outside the lab, they act normally, but inside it, they descend into madness. The film's most intense moment doesn't rely on special effects, but a creepy guy with 4% body fat instead. Filming Rubber's Lover was also intense, Fukuya insisted on silence between takes to make the actors feel alienated. The end result was a new direction for Yojohan, away from visceral shocks towards more of a slow burn. Unfortunately for Fukuya, by the time it was released in 1996, filmgoers had moved on. By the late 90s, Japan was in the middle of a long recession. To revive the economy, the government invested in cultural industries. Under the banner of Cool Japan, some Japanese filmmakers enjoyed success in Western countries, but fortunes for the Yojohan directors were mixed, to say the least. Only Tsukamoto and Ishii sustained careers after the 90s. Shigeru Izumiya never directed again, while Shozin Fukui focused on short films after Rubber's Lover. In terms of a legacy, it's hard to find directors who followed in their footsteps. Instead, the last word on Yojohan came from Tsukamoto, who, after working outside the genre for 17 years, released another Tetsuo sequel in 2009. The Bullet Man stuck closely to Yojohan themes and style, but Tsukamoto mixed things up with an American actor in the lead. When Tetsuo 3 was originally conceived in the mid-90s, it was to have been produced by Quentin Tarantino and set in the US. Given Japan and America's complex relations, that idea made sense, and if it had gone ahead, maybe the genre would have been more popular. But I like that these films are still quite obscure. It means that every few years, a Gesuyaru like myself can rediscover them all over again. And having done that, I can say that they're more than just a spin-off of Western cyberpunk. Yojohan Sci-Fi is rooted in Japan's post-war society, and the similarities between these films are a condition of the cultural and economic factors in the society when they were made. Yojohan is very much its own thing, so although Shinya Tsukamoto came up with that tag to describe his own films, I think it's fair to include the work of his peers along with them. Anyway, I've already gone on far too long. You should get off here and go and watch some of these films. But before you do that, can I ask you a favour? I know it's really cringe when YouTubers ask this, but here goes anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.